When we are children, we are 100% reliant on our families. We rely on them for everything, for love, connection, warmth, sense of belonging, survival. We also crave close relationships with them, and because we need them so much, we tend to accept things just the way that they are. We might notice that there are differences in family structures, that our friend Jimmy down the road only has one parent, or Jenny spends the weekends with a different parent than she's with during the weekday. But for the most part, we assume that our family relationships are normal. It's not really until we get more world experience or start talking to a broader range of people outside our family do we begin to wonder if we're seeing relationships in a different way from others. For some people who grew up in dysfunctional families, this shift in perspective can be like turning on a light switch. Suddenly they see their experiences through an entirely different lens, and what once seemed black and white is now full color. My name is Oliver and I'm a family systems therapist, and in this video I'm going to talk to you about 5 dysfunctional family dynamics. And for each of those family dynamics I'm going to give you 3 questions, and these questions are designed to get you thinking about your own family of origin and what constitutes normal and what constitutes healthy. As a therapist, I've seen how powerful the shift in perspective can be when you realize what's normal and what's healthy. I mean, it's not easy realizing that the family you grew up in wasn't normal or wasn't healthy, but it is an essential part in moving forward and healing. Family systems therapists have a very specific way of looking at family dynamics. So I'll be taking you through these 5 dysfunctional family dynamics through the lens of family systems. I'm going to guide you through these 5 dysfunctional family dynamics through the lens of family structure, self and other, which is just another way of saying relationships, and thoughts and feelings, which is about communication, and more specifically emotional communication. All right, let's go. Before we dive into the 5 dysfunctional family dynamics, let me explain each of these 3 concepts in a little more detail, and then we'll get right into it. I'm going to take this opportunity to ask you please to hit subscribe. Let me know that you want more family dynamic videos or family systems videos, and I'll keep them coming. The first concept is family structure. And just like an organization needs to have a CEO and employees with different roles and have different departments and tasks within them, a family needs to have its own version of a structure. The analogy there isn't quite perfect, I know, but if you think about it, we always want to have adults running the show. We always want to have adults as the CEOs. In fact, we know from decades of research that when children have too much power or influence, a family can really begin to struggle. Things would go wrong for the company if we were to let toddlers into a board meeting and have them come up with the marketing campaign. Same is true for a family. We'll do thoughts and feelings next. What we're talking about here is communication, but also emotional communication. Our communication as parents to children needs to be clear enough to let them know not to touch the hot stove. It has to be warm enough for them to feel loved, and directive enough to set expectations and clarify boundaries. Communication is really important. When it comes to communication, we need to be able to distinguish thoughts from feelings, which is surprisingly hard for us. Next time you ask someone how they feel about something, I bet there is a 90% chance that they will give you a thought. And the indicator there is they will say, I feel that. Whenever that follows I feel, it's a thought. Trust me on that. Much of my work in therapy is helping my clients really feel and articulate their feelings and get them separate from thoughts. An ideal situation for all of us is to have thoughts and feelings balanced and separate. As you'll see in some of the families that we're going to talk about, there's an overemphasis on thinking or thoughts in some families, and in others there's an overemphasis on feelings, which are often very big and dramatic, and most often thoughts and feelings are mushed up or overlapping. Self and other. This one is a little harder to explain, but you might be able to imagine that we have an internalized version of ourself, because for the most part, you know who you are and you have a chronological sense of yourself that tells a story of who you are over time. And this accounts for how you can see how you've changed and grown, and what you believe in and what you value, which is about our identity. And identity is just another way of saying self. Having a stable sense of self, knowing who we are, having an identity allows us to be in relationship with other people. And that is because we have an internalized representation of the people we are closest to in our lives. I call that other. So with an internalized sense of self and an internalized sense of other, I can remember my relationships. The internalized other that represents my dog helps me remember that he might need dog food when I'm at the grocery store. Now, I can't scientifically prove this, but I'm pretty sure my dog has an internalized version of me in his head, which would be his other, because he seems to remember me, looks vaguely excited when I walk through the door, and generally wants to hang out with me. So we have an internalized self and we have internalized other, and that's how we remember our relationships. It's a little bit of object relations for you, for those in the know. Before we get into enmeshed families, here are the 3 statements or questions that are going to get you thinking about your family of origin. So rate each of these statements from 0 to 5, 0 being I disagree completely, and 5 being oh my gosh, that's me, yes. So the first statement is, growing up, our family had very little need for friends outside the family. Number 2, you felt or were made to feel guilty if you wanted to do things away from the family. Number 3, we relied on and depended on each other for everything. So let's talk about structure. If this is a healthy family structure, then an enmeshed family looks more like this. Everyone is very close to each other. There's not a lot of distance between family members. And more importantly, at least from a structural family systems perspective, we have children in and out of the parent levels. This is a really important concept to understand. There are some things as a parent we want to shield our kids from, like if we can pay the mortgage this month, or if you think your co-parent is drinking too much and not being a good parent at all. Those are all totally valid thoughts and experiences, but revealing those things to a child would be letting them into this upper parent zone, which is separate for this exact reason. There are some things that are too much or too heavy for a child to know or deal with. An enmeshed family will often have children and parents in very confusing positions to kids, and it leaves them feeling too responsible, overwhelmed, and anxious. So you can probably imagine then that parents in an enmeshed family have a hard time separating out self from other. Parents that are enmeshed with their kids don't entirely see their children as being unique individual creatures who are free to explore the world and grow up to be whoever they are. I call this blurring of self and other a self and other situation, and I see it a lot in my clinical practice. A child's experience of an enmeshed family or a self and other situation is very confusing. The messages are that they have to follow along with what their parent wants, and individual needs have to be suppressed, or else there will be a big reaction from parents. Alternatively, if a child expresses an interest in Disneyland or Disney princesses, then all of a sudden the entire family is wearing Donald Duck t-shirts and Disney princess crowns, and they've booked the Disney cruise and they're watching the Disney Channel. And as a young child, experiencing this might not be perceived as negative at all. In fact, it could be a wonderful experience, having everyone excited about the same thing. But as the teenage years hits, there is a natural tendency for adolescents to push away from their family, to want to be a different person, an individual. And they are going to have a big emotional reaction to their inability to express uniqueness or develop an identity away from their family. They're going to feel claustrophobic and smothered. Thoughts and feelings are not going to be separate in this family, and it kind of overlaps with self and other a little bit. So when one person is sad, the other person will be sad just because. There might also be rules around what the family can feel. So we are a happy family, or in this family we don't get angry. When you're a young child with these family rules going on, then it's very, very tricky for a child to understand what to do when they are angry or they're not happy. The dilemma is that then they're going to break the parents' rules, which is intolerable for a young person who's still very reliant on their parents. What happens then is feelings often get repressed or suppressed. And the problem is you can't really do that with feelings. Feelings have to come out. You can try all you want to bottle them up or keep them down, but eventually they will come out, and probably not in the way that you want. The opposite of an enmeshed family is a distant family or disengaged family. And here are 3 questions that might resonate with you if you had a distant or disengaged family. And again, if you rate it from 1 to 5, with 5 being very much agree, the higher the score, the more likely this might relate to you. So the first statement is, your family seldom did things together. Number 2, family members got on better with people outside the family than they did with people inside the family. Number 3, family members know very little about the lives of other people in the family. Let's talk about structure. When you compare a distant or disengaged family with a healthy family structure, there's a very obvious distance. The family members have a lot of space between them, which you can interpret as being emotional distance rather than physical, or it could actually be both. Now, in the 1800s, we literally thought that children were tiny adult barbarians who just needed to have morals and rules beaten into them. So family structures might have looked a lot like this. But since then, we've gained an understanding into the developmental needs that children have in order to become happy, healthy young adults. And that's to do with warmth and connection, which you can't do in a disengaged or distant family. Children need to feel close and connected to their parents, and we know this from attachment theory and the experiments that psychologists did on maternal deprivation. We've got decades of research to know that a distant, disengaged family does not create happy kids. The self and other patterns in the distant or disengaged families might look more like this. The self of the parent looks very much larger than that of the child. And the implication here is that children are not thought of as much or thought of as being as important as they might be considered in a healthy family. These parents might find their children an annoyance or not important. Now, this makes punishing children much easier because they're not as important to disengaged parents. So there might be more corporal punishment in these families or even physical abuse. Self and other refers to our ability to think about and consider another person. So of course, when a child or other is not very important to a parent, this can also look like neglect. All right, triangles. Triangles and triangulation are very common in relationships and not always in a healthy way. It is very difficult for two people to stay related to each other without involving another person, another object, or an idea. And the way we get around the difficulty of being in a relationship with someone is to bring in a third person. If you grew up with a sibling, you probably know what this looks like, because hopefully when you and your sibling were squabbling over Lego or toys, a parent most likely will have stepped in to separate you out or make you resolve the issue or whatever it is. That's a healthy example of triangulation because parents will be modeling how to resolve conflict and negotiate sharing things. But the principle is the same. You and your sibling were squabbling, there was conflict between you, and a third person was brought in to help. The same goes on for adult relationships, but in a much less healthy way. When two parents are having difficulty staying connected and intimate and close to each other, a third thing gets brought in. Now, sometimes that could be work. So I'll notice one parent staying longer and longer at the office to avoid whatever is going on in the relationship. But most often it's a third person. And this is where affairs come from. So when two parents aren't meeting each other's needs or talking about it, then one parent might go elsewhere to get those needs met. And of course, this isn't just sexual needs. Emotional affairs are a real thing. It's never appropriate when two parents triangulate a child into the relationship. And this is a major dysfunctional family dynamic. So here are some questions to get you thinking about if your family used triangulation too much. Were there certain family members who tended to take sides or form alliances with each other? Did family members ever involve you in their conflicts with other people or ask you to take sides? Did one parent overshare issues in their marital relationship or seek comfort from you or attempt to get you to see their point of view about another person or co-parent? To better understand triangulation, I have to add an element to my structural diagrams, and it's this squiggle between two parents that represents some form of conflict. I could also create a version that represents emotional distance with two parents being far apart from each other. And the triangle would be represented like this, with the child taking the side of one parent as a result of being brought closer to them. You might have noticed that I like putting things on a spectrum. So at an extreme end, this is what parental alienation syndrome is all about. It's a triangle to such an extreme that one parent aligns against another with a kid to push them away or make them the bad parent. Most versions of triangulation are not so extreme as to force another parent out of the house, but there will have been some form of alliances and sides. This is a horribly confusing message for a child who really needs to feel the love from both caregivers caregivers equally. So looking through self and other, the parent who is actively drawing the child into the triangle to take a side has a self and other situation going on. They're not seeing the child as separate from themselves, and they're sort of selfishly involving another person in what is really their own struggle or conflict. There's also some self and other situation going on between co-parents when this is happening. Most likely, one parent doesn't feel that they can articulate their needs or wants to the other parent. So there's some blurring of the two parts in that relation too, which leads us nicely into thoughts and feelings. Ultimately, triangulation is an issue of thoughts and feelings between two caregivers. When thoughts and feelings are operating independently, I can have thoughts about my feelings, feelings about my thoughts. I can separate out my thoughts and feelings about the other person too. When they're all mushed up, there is a complete lack of effective emotional communication. If the caregivers are feeling distant from each other, there's often a sign that there's a lack of emotional communication there. They aren't able to talk about their feelings, so they grow apart over time. If there's conflict going on, we'll look at that in a little bit with the high conflict family, but it's an issue of thoughts and feelings too, and needing to have self-soothing skills and the language to repair ruptures. Let's talk about parentification and adultification. If you were to combine the enmeshed family dynamic with the triangulated family dynamic, you might get a family dysfunction known as parentification or adultification. Now, these are very similar terms, but slightly different. Parentification is a form of role corruption characterized by a parent enlisting a child to fulfill their needs to be cared for. Now, this can be due to physical or logistical necessity, such as an illness or economic hardship, but also when the parent is depressed, using substances, widowed, or some other sort of pathological thing going on. So the child can be actively enlisted into helping take care of the parent, or it can be a passive acceptance of the role because of situational and circumstances. Either way, it's very dysfunctional. Now, adultification is distinct but not incompatible with parentification. In this situation, the adultified child becomes more of a friend and a confidant and an ally rather than a caregiver. The child shares some degree of practical or emotional responsibility with their parent in a relationship that's partner-like. Often the child is exposed to adult knowledge prematurely and inappropriately and assumes adult roles and responsibilities. So here are some questions to get you thinking about whether this was happening in your family dynamic. Number one, were you ever expected to take on responsibilities beyond your age or ability, such as caring for siblings or managing household duties? Were you ever placed in a parental role, such as providing emotional support for parents or making important decisions for the family? Do you ever feel guilty about wanting to or actually pursuing your own life away from your family of origin? Again, the higher the score, the more likely this may have been a thing in your family. So let's look at family structure. A family structure in which parentification or adultification looks a lot like enmeshment meets triangulation. Parentified children have been elevated into the parent zone and have a huge amount of emotional pressure to take care for a parent. Now, this is undoubtedly a massive psychological stressor that will have an impact on any child who is forced to grow up before they're ready to. The parental child becomes the parent to a parent at the cost of the child's normal and age-appropriate process of separation and individuation. This is a big impairment. In adultified families, the parent will often turn to the child for validation and practical assistance more frequently and more appropriately than they should. The adult will mistake the child's eagerness and acceptance of their role as being helpful or insightful and completely overlook the child's potential fear of rejection. So in doing so, the parent will justify their rationale for enlisting an ally because they'll say the kid likes it. Adultified children are often the firstborn or the only child. Sometimes they are groomed to take this role on with lots of praise on how mature they are and getting lots of encouragement to be more mature or perhaps act less young. Just like in enmeshment, there is a self and other situation going on in which parents have a hard time seeing their child as an individual, and they might even see their child as an extension of self. Parentified or adultified children will often grow up with symptoms like depression, guilt, worry, social isolation. There's often a huge amount of shame or guilt because it felt on some level like these young adults failed at their job. And that's because by default, it is impossible for a child to be perfectly good at being the parent of an adult that is their parent. Thoughts and feelings are functions of the brain that need to be developed and modeled for us. So in adults who were parentified or adultified as a child, I expect them to have a hard time knowing their feelings and not being able to express them very well. When we don't know our feelings, we get a lot of somatic complaints. So this might be chronic back pain or headaches or something like that. That's a symptom of really suppressed feelings. The final dysfunctional family dynamic is high conflict or violent families. Now, conflict is just a part of being in a relationship with another person. We all have disagreements. We all get emotional, but ideally we can disagree, get frustrated, but then repair and work through it and become even closer. Relationship conflict can, in a weird way, be a positive thing. In fact, if a family says they never get in any conflict, I am often worried because I just don't see how that is possible. When conflict becomes too frequent or escalates to the point of violence, that is acting out on the feelings of anger and it becomes dysfunctional. Emotionally mature adults do not hit things, definitely don't hit other people, they don't slam doors or give family members the silent treatment. That's also a very aggressive act in my books. Here are some questions to get you thinking if you were in a high conflict or violent household. Number one, did you grow up in a family where conflicts often escalated into verbal or physical violence? Number two, were you ever afraid to express your thoughts or feelings openly for fear of being met with aggression, violence, or even the silent treatment? Did you ever feel like you or other family members were constantly vying for power or control with little regard for others' needs or feelings? Again, if you score each of those 0 to 5, the higher the score, the more likely this is applicable to you. High conflict families are often enmeshed, which may not make sense, but when you don't let the other person be an individual who is separate from you, it is incredibly challenging to not get angry or frustrated with them. A family structure might be harder to map out, but I would probably depict it like this, with two parents being very close, or two parents with the squiggle between them. If the conflict is with a child and a parent, that could be because the child feels emotionally distant from the parent and is angry at the lack of connection. Or if the child is overly close to a parent, you can see a lot of conflict there because they feel smothered and the anger and conflict is all about trying to get some independence. Self and other. Just like in enmeshment, there's a self and other situation going on here in which parents have a hard time seeing the child or their partner as an individual. They often see them as an extension of the self again and have strong reactions to their child pulling away and becoming an individual. So I often hear in my private practice, a parent will say something like, well, I try to take my kid to baseball games and I sign them up for all the classes and the baseball summer camps, and I just don't understand why they don't apply themselves. I liked it when I was a kid. I just don't get it. I'll often be a bit snarky at this point and ask the teenager if they're present, if they actually like baseball. And the kid will 99% probability say no or not really. I'll then have to explain to dad that the conflict is occurring because he's trying to force the kid into liking something that the kid doesn't. You're forcing them to like baseball because you liked baseball or you think it's a good idea for them. A parent like this has a great deal of difficulty of seeing their child as an individual. It actually causes us some anxiety when someone we care about starts showing signs of being different from us, having different values or different beliefs or different interests. So we try even harder to make them similar to us. Conflict between parents and teens is often about a parent trying to make the teen something that they're not. Thoughts and feelings. You might think here that feelings are the problem in a high conflict family, and you wouldn't necessarily be wrong because anger really does get in the way of anything logical or any reasoning happening. When we are super angry or dysregulated, the part of our brain responsible for reasoning and logic goes offline. It's the prefrontal neocortex here. So if you're in a rage, walk away. Nothing good will happen if you stay engaged with the person you're angry at. Before a disagreement reaches the point of anger and violence, I often find in family, though, that thoughts are to blame, not necessarily the feelings. In a lot of families I work with, family members are very good at giving their thoughts about things and really struggle to name their feelings. If in a family I wasn't able to say, wow, it really hurt my feelings when you called me a family systems nerd just then, my hurt feelings will never get addressed. Nobody will apologize for them. I won't be able to express how painful that was. Most families who have a high amount of conflict would probably respond with a thought rather than a vulnerable feeling of, ow, that hurt. They'd say something like, oh, really? You're calling me a nerd? Well, let me tell you what you are. You're a and then. So there will be anger in the response, which is a feeling, obviously, but it's a primary feeling. And that's the feeling that comes up first and covers up all of the other ones. If family members can't express their feelings, the tender ones, the hurt ones, the loving ones, then conflict over time becomes incredibly toxic. Nothing ever gets resolved or worked through, and hurt feelings kind of get infected and fester. People become more reactive and hypersensitive to comments and perceived criticisms of others. So there we go. Those are the 5 dysfunctional family dynamics through a systemic lens. I would love to know if you resonated with any of them. And if I missed one, let me know. I'd be happy to make another video and talk about this some more. Please hit subscribe, like, share, comment, all of those things, because the goal of My People Patterns is to help everyone grow great relationships.